My name is Claire, and I never imagined the man I loved would wake me with lies that shattered everything. We drove out to that old cottage on the edge of the woods, thinking we'd find peace. But as soon as we crossed the stone bridge, something in the air felt heavier, like it was waiting to confess a secret. That afternoon, he paced on the porch with a loose shirt, hands shoved in pockets, jaw clenched so tight I could almost hear the cracking of bone. I watched him through foggy glass, my heart thudding like a trapped bird. I tried to brush it off, to smile and ask about tea, but my voice caught in my throat. My hands were trembling, fingers slick with sweat. Inside, the cottage smelled of dusty pine and stale coffee. I sank onto the threadbare couch, pulling my knees close, and I thought I saw his reflection flicker on the window. There was a second movement, a shadow that didn't belong. I shook my head, trying to clear the doubt. It felt like when you remember a face half forgotten, or when a song you love turns bittersweet all of a sudden. That night, we sat by the fireplace, embers whispering secrets. He stared at me through the dancing light, eyes flickering. His fingers tapped against his leg, like he was counting down to a confession I wasn't ready for. I pressed my lips together, feeling the weight of every unspoken word. My heartbeat was too loud, filling up the quiet room. A few hours later, I found the first clue. A folded note half hidden under his jacket on the chair. I fished it out with my fingernail, hands shaking so much I could barely hold it. The edges were creased, words smudged with coffee. At first I thought it was a poem, something sweet, but the lines twisted in my mind. Forgive me someday, but tonight I must be free. And beneath that, a name I'd never heard. My mouth went dry, like I'd just swallowed sand. I spun around, and he was leaning in the doorway, watching me tear the note. I could feel the tension crackle between us, like live wires. He didn't say anything for a long moment, just stood there, chest rising and falling. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, too soft. "I'm sorry," he whispered, like it was a shield and a weapon all at once. I felt something inside break, but I couldn't tell if it was my anger or my disbelief. I wanted to scream, to demand every truth, but a lump lodged in my throat. My hands clenched into fists at my sides. He came closer, and I could see the regret written in every line of his face. But regret couldn't fix a fractured promise. Before I could reply, he turned away, stepping back into the shadows. The last thing I heard was his voice trailing behind him, "I'll explain soon." And then silence swallowed the room. I stayed where I was, heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window panes like impatient prisoners. I didn't know if morning would bring answers or more lies. All I knew was that the ground had shifted beneath me, and there was no going back. And in that moment, as the firelight died down, I realized the man beside me had changed, and maybe so had I. Perhaps this retreat was never about peace, it was about revealing every hidden fracture. And I understood then that what began tonight would flow into something I couldn't yet name. Something raw and unforgiving, like water carving stone. But I was ready to see it through, even if it meant diving into the darkest currents of truth. The first rays of dawn filtered through the threadbare curtains, turning the cottage's interior into muted gold. I stayed frozen on the couch, note clutched in my hand, listening to the wood floors creak as he moved about. Each step felt like an accusation. I pressed my palm against my chest, heart hammering so fiercely it almost drowned out his footsteps. My breaths came shallow, uneven, as though I were learning how to breathe again. I dared not call out. Eventually, his silhouette appeared outside the window, shoulders hunched and heavy. He looked like someone I used to know, but I couldn't place the certainty I once felt in his embrace. Something essential had slipped through our fingers. He lingered in the doorway, an absence of light behind him, before speaking in a voice so low it felt like a tremor under my skin. "Claire, I want to explain," he said. His tone wavered, a quiet tremor that betrayed more than words ever could. I rose slowly, knees stiff, and crossed the room until I stood just beyond his reach. My jaw felt locked, but I hammered out 2 words, "Why?" It came out more like a broken question than a demand. He swallowed hard, gaze on the worn floorboards as though they might hold the answer. For a long beat, silence stretched taut between us. Then he spoke of debts and desperation in a voice laced with guilt, of nights spent haggling beneath flickering streetlights, of voices whispered in cold corridors. His confession stumbled over itself as though shame tripped each syllable. I watched his hands twist together, knuckles white, veins like coarse cords beneath thin skin. He talked about betrayal, but his shame was deeper than any simple dishonesty. It was a wound he'd carved himself. I felt tears burn behind my eyes, but my lips stayed rigid. "You think you're sorry?" I said, voice trembling, words biting through the thick air. He flinched as though I had struck him. Something within me roared, grief, anger, disbelief all colliding, leaving me bruised and raw. My hands flew to my mouth, stifling a sob. His explanation, jagged as broken glass, only revealed how little I truly knew him. We stood there, a few ragged breaths apart, shoulders taut with tension. Then I turned toward the small kitchen table, where the remains of our breakfast lay, cold toast, spilled coffee. I sank into the chair, wrapping my arms around my waist as though trying to hold myself together. He followed slowly, pulling out the chair opposite me, gaze fixed on my trembling form. He started unbuttoning his shirt, revealing a hidden scar that ran along his ribcage, thin and faded. My breath hitched. I remember the night I first kissed that spot, tracing it with curious fingertips. He'd said it was nothing. But now I knew it marked a different kind of story, one he'd never shared. The scar was a foreshadowing, a silent declaration of pain and secrets I hadn't unraveled. I reached out, fingers hovering an inch from his skin, and pulled back at the last second. My throat tightened as the truth settled in my bones. This cottage, these secrets, his justifications, they were all a trap. A betrayal sown with half-truths and hidden wounds. I felt the ground shift beneath me again. He looked up, eyes reddened, mouth open as though to explain further, but the words caught in his throat. I realized then that nothing he could say would bridge the gulf between us. The love we once shared was contaminated by lies he'd nurtured in the dark. I stood, voice hollow. "I need to see everything," I said. The air vibrated with a tension so thick it felt almost visible. He nodded slowly, acceptance and fear mingling in his features. He pointed to a stack of old journals on the shelf, a whisper of what would come next. My fingers brushed the leather-bound covers, and I felt both dread and resolve tighten like a knot in my chest. That moment became an invitation to step deeper into the maze of his betrayal. As I opened the first journal, the faint scent of ink and regret rose up, welcoming me into the truth I had demanded. I braced myself for every hidden confession, every secret he'd tucked away, and faced the flood that would follow. I lifted the leather cover and the pages whispered beneath my fingertips. Words scrawled in his shaky handwriting blurred together, but at the bottom of the first page I spotted a crease. I pried it open and discovered a faded photograph tucked inside a folded paper envelope. In the photo, he and a woman I didn't recognize were standing close beside that same cottage, their arms wrapped around each other, smiles so genuine it made my chest ache. The light in her eyes mirrored the firelight I remembered when we first arrived, but her presence in his arms felt like a blade twisting deeper into my ribs. I held the photograph at arm's length, vision swimming. My hands shook so badly I almost dropped it. The edges were worn, as though he'd carried it with him in secret places I'd never known. That proof was a betrayal incarnate, no note, no explanation. Just a captured moment of intimacy that had excluded me. I pressed it to my heart, feeling both rage and sorrow collide like storms. A few pages later, I found the second proof, a handwritten message scrawled across a torn fragment of notepad paper. It read, "Meet me at midnight. We need to talk before she finds out." My pulse thundered against my ribs. Who was she? And what did they need to talk about? I traced each letter with trembling fingertips, tasting betrayal in every curve of ink. I sank onto the floor, leaning my back against the wall as the cottage grew silent around me. The journals lay open like wounds bleeding secrets. My chest felt tight, lungs constricting with each ragged breath. My throat burned with unshed tears. It was like standing at the edge of a cliff, staring into a darkness that threatened to swallow me whole. Yet I knew I had to keep going. I flipped back to the earliest entries. There he wrote of his sleepless nights, but instead of concern for me, they bled with regret for choices I couldn't see. There was mention of phone calls he'd slipped outside, hushed conversations that left his jean pockets lined with crumpled bills. I felt bile rise up, heat licking the back of my throat. His secret life was a maze I had just begun to navigate, and every breadcrumb only deepened the betrayal. That night, I gathered the proofs, photo in one hand, the message in the other, and confronted him by the dying fire. The way his shoulders sagged told me he'd already seen my discovery. He reached out, but I recoiled, chest heaving, palms slick with sweat. His apology caught in his throat. My voice came out raw, "Why lie?" His eyes filled with something like regret and dread. He opened his mouth, but no words could untangle the web he'd spun. I waited as the final embers flickered. Each beat of my heart felt like a countdown to something irrevocable. His silence stretched until I realized I had to fill the void. "I gave you everything," I whispered. "Everything." My voice cracked. Heat flushed my cheeks. Tears threatened to fall, but I blinked them back, wanting him to see that I was broken but still standing. He lowered his gaze, shoulders trembling. Then he did something I never imagined. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small key. His hand shook, but his voice was firm. "There's something else." He led me to the back of the cottage where an old lockbox sat beneath a dusty quilt. Inside, I found more photographs, ticket stubs, and letters, proof of a parallel life I'd never glimpsed. My breath caught as I sifted through each item. The weight of his secrets pressed down, and I realized the betrayal was only beginning. I closed the lockbox slowly, keys jingling in the hush. My hands trembled, chest tight, mind racing with questions I feared. That moment changed everything. I knew I had to decide, fight back or vanish into the shadows of what we once had. As the lockbox lid clicked shut, the cottage seemed to shift, the walls leaning in as if eavesdropping. I hugged my arms around my ribcage, trying to steady the tremor that coursed through every inch of me. His face was pale, eyes locked on mine with an intensity that made my skin prickle. I swallowed, tasting the metallic tang of adrenaline, and tried to summon words. He cleared his throat, voice low. "There's more you deserve to know," he said, each syllable weighed down by regret. He stepped back, shoulders hunched, and I realized he was bracing himself, like he'd been rehearsing this confession in nightmares. My heart pounded, uneven, like a trapped bird slamming against its cage. I leaned forward, burning with a mixture of dread and fierce need to know the whole truth. He opened his mouth, but then paused, as though listening to some echo only he could hear. The faint scrape of his shoe on the wooden floor sounded impossibly loud. I felt a dry lump rise in my throat. My fingers dug into the edge of the table, nails biting tiny crescents of skin. "Just start," I managed. My voice was brittle, the words crackling like broken glass. He nodded slowly, each movement deliberate. He told me about phone calls at odd hours, about money funneled into accounts I'd never heard of. He spoke of a diagnosis he'd discovered only weeks before, the reason he'd been irritable, distracted, running out into the night for solitary conversations. A rare illness that demanded expensive treatment he could never hope to afford. I blinked as he described it, the revelation hitting like a blow. The woman in the photograph had been an advocate at a clinic, someone who'd offered him a secret lifeline he'd clung to desperately. My chest tightened. Rage and compassion tangled together, each breath a struggle. I could feel the ache in my jaw where I'd been clenching my teeth. My fingers loosened, then curled again. He watched me, eyes pleading, as though begging for forgiveness he didn't deserve. I thought about every moment of tenderness we'd shared, every promise whispered in the dark, and realized they'd been tangled with his fear, too. "You should have trusted me," I whispered, voice breaking. "Or at least told me." Tears pricked my eyes, but I blinked them back, unwilling to give him the satisfaction of seeing me break. He closed his own eyes, shoulders sagging, as though the confession itself was a release and a burden. I felt the cottage breathe around us, windows rattling in a sudden gust, the stove ticking as metal cooled. Then he did something unexpected. He stepped forward and laid his hands on my shoulders. His touch was tentative, as though he feared I'd shatter. I stayed still, heart hammering, letting him hold me while the truth settled like ash. It was an apology and a plea woven into a single gesture. My breath came ragged, and I realized I was shaking not just from anger but from relief that I finally knew the shape of his secrets. A long silence stretched between us, pregnant with things unsaid. The crackle of the fire in the grate sounded like distant thunder. I closed my eyes, recalling how his fingertips had once traced the curves of my face with tenderness. Now those same hands trembled. I wondered if the illness had hollowed him out, left him grasping for reasons to keep going. When I opened my eyes again, I saw a man I barely recognized, but also the one I still loved, buried beneath layers of fear and deception. My mind spun with possibilities, to walk away from it all, to stand by him, or to carve out my own path through the wreckage. The cottage felt both refuge and prison. Outside, twilight draped the woods in a violet hush, as though the world beyond was holding its breath. I drew a slow breath and looked at him. "I need time," I said, voice steady. He nodded, relief flickering in his eyes. Together we moved to the windowsill and watched the last light ebb, two silhouettes bound by secrets now laid bare. The path ahead was uncertain, twisted with pain and hope in equal measure, but at least the current of truth had begun to carry us forward. Morning light sifted through the trees, painting the cottage in a hesitant glow as I traced the lines of his confession still echoing in my mind. I perched on the windowsill, shoulders hunched, fingertips tapping the weathered wood. My chest felt tight, lungs hollow and ragged, as though every breath had to fight its way in. The weight of last night's revelations pressed on me like damp stone. I remembered his trembling voice, the crack in his words, and how those secrets had fallen like ashes at my feet. I closed my eyes, tasting the bitterness of betrayal on my tongue, and drew in a shuddering breath. I thought of his hands on my shoulders, that apology woven into a single, desperate gesture. But apologies could not lift the fractures he'd carved between us. I rose, knees shaky, and crossed the room to the kitchen. Each step echoed, a slow drumbeat marking my resolve. I filled a chipped mug with cold water, each drop a tiny hammer against the silence. He appeared behind me, moving like someone made of cautious regret. His voice was low, careful. "Claire, are you?" He broke off as I turned, eyes narrowed, jaw set. My voice trembled but held steel. "I'm not done," I whispered. "I need more." He hesitated, gaze flicking to the stack of letters and photographs I'd collected. I watched the tension coil through his shoulders. He braced himself, as though stepping into a storm. He led me once more to the desk in the corner. The lockbox lay open beneath a dusty quilt, its contents scattered like shards of his hidden life. I picked up another photograph, him smiling with confidence I'd never seen, and let it fall. My heart pounded so loudly I feared it would betray me. Beneath the photo, I found a folded prescription form, the dosage scribbled in a hand I knew too well. My breath hitched, a sob caught in my throat. I pressed the paper to my chest, feeling the outline of words against my skin like a brand. He knelt beside me, voice soft. "It's for the treatment," he said. His admission wove through the air like smoke. This illness had stolen his nights, his clarity, and forced him into shadows. He confessed how he'd met the advocate at a clinic and how her kindness had felt like salvation. Yet he'd hidden it all from me, convinced he was sparing me pain. I felt something twist inside, anger and pity jostling in a cage. I stood abruptly, chair screeching back. My palms pressed against the table, knuckles whitening. The wood grain was rough beneath my skin, but I welcomed the bite. "You spared me pain," I said, voice wavering. "But you built walls I can't scale." My words trembled, carried by a guttural ache in my throat. He looked up, tears pooling, his confession laying bare all that he feared I'd never understand. I paced the room, thighs trembling, as I weighed the fragments of his truth. Every secret became a tool in my grasp. I tasted the iron tang of vengeance on my tongue and let it settle heavy in my belly. I imagined the slow undoing, revealing his hidden account balances to the bank managers, exposing his clandestine midnight meetings to the neighbors who whispered in hushed tones. Not a public humiliation, but a quiet stripping away of every carefully constructed lie. He followed me until I turned on him, eyes blazing. His own gaze flickered between fear and pleading. "Don't," he whispered. But I shook my head, shoulders tight with resolve. "You let me wander in darkness," I said. My voice cracked, but the intent behind it was unyielding. "Now you'll know what it feels like." He sank to the floor as I slipped the prescription and photographs into my coat pocket. My fingertips brushed his hand, lingering, part remorse, part promise. A final ember of our love flickered and died between us. I stepped toward the door, each footfall deliberate. Outside, the forest whispered encouragement. The wind carried away my hesitation, urging me forward. I paused at the threshold, hand on the latch. I glanced back once, his silhouette crumpled in fear and regret. My heart pounded, tears threatening, but anger governed my blood. I pushed the door open, stepping into the haze of morning, and felt the current of revenge pull me onward. The reckoning had begun. Morning light filtered through shifting clouds as I stepped onto the main road, the forest's edge retreating behind me. Each footfall carried the weight of every secret I'd uncovered. My coat pocket pressed against my hip, reminding me of the lockbox key I'd returned to the cottage table and the silent proof I'd delivered to the bank. The world felt taut, each breath a countdown to whatever came next. I drove toward town, the road cutting through misty fields that glowed with dew. My pulse slowed as I let the car coast, memories of his apologetic eyes mingling with the resolve that drove me. I knew I had to finish this, give his lies the reckoning they demanded. My first move would be to ensure his clinic advocate could no longer tiptoe through his hidden pain. I pulled into her parking lot and waited until she emerged, phone to ear, her shoulders hunched as though bracing for bad news. When she saw me, surprise flickered across her face. I smiled softly, voice catching with faux vulnerability. "I know this is sudden," I said, placing a journal entry on the hood of my car, "but you deserve the full truth about him." Her eyes filled with tears as she read the admissions of addiction and deception. I watched her dignity fracture, then turned away before words of gratitude, or accusation, could catch in my throat. Next, I slipped into the bank lobby mid-morning, the marble floors echoing beneath my boots. I approached the same window where I'd frozen his accounts. This time, I handed the teller a note, "Please forward all correspondence from his hidden lines to me." I whispered that I feared he'd abandon treatment altogether. She nodded gravely, her gaze flicking to the security camera. I held her eye, a silent pact forged in that brief exchange. By noon, rumors spread through town like sparks in dry grass. I watched from my car as he braced the teller's window, confusion etched across his face. His shoulders sagged when he realized his funds were frozen. I felt a hollow triumph. He was learning the taste of betrayal, but I still hungered for more closure. The final act required the neighbors. I went door to door, weaving tales of clandestine midnight visits and suspicious packages. Each story added a new layer of doubt, and I felt the ebb of my own guilt as they shuttered their windows, lowered their voices, and watched for him. I imagined him pacing on the porch of our cottage, isolated and cornered by the very walls he'd built to hide. Late afternoon sun burned low when I returned to the clearing by the woods. The path back to the cottage wound beneath tall pines, their needles whispering overhead. My heart pounded as I neared the front gate. The door swung open before I could knock, and he stood there, disheveled, pale, eyes wide with a mix of fear and pleading. "Claire, please," he rasped. His voice cracked, raw and ragged. "Why are you doing this?" I stepped inside, closing the door behind me and letting the evening hush settle. My voice was low, calm, almost gentle. "You built your lies into our lives," I said, fingers tightening around the last envelope I carried. I placed it on the table, photographs of him with that advocate, tickets to a distant city, scraps of proof I hadn't shared before. His posture crumpled as each new piece of evidence landed. I wanted to love you, I whispered, but you wouldn't let me. My breath hitched, tears stinging my eyes. I held his gaze, and I saw the man I loved flicker behind the mask of desperation. He opened his mouth, but no words came. I turned to the window, watching dusk deepen the forest's shadows. This river we set in motion, I said quietly, it's carried us both far from where we began. But I choose where it ends. I felt the ache of departure and the fierce pulse of liberation entwine within me. He dropped to his knees, shoulders shaking. I hesitated, a fragment of compassion stirring. But the current of revenge had pulled me too far downstream to return. I walked away, the door clicking shut as his sobs echoed behind me. Outside, twilight rose like a promise, uncertain, uncharted, and wholly my own. The sky had deepened into velvet by the time I reached the edge of town, exhaust settling like a second skin around my shoulders. The street lamps flickered on one by one, their pale golden glow revealing footprints in the damp pavement, evidence of others moving through this place I once thought I knew. I walked with deliberate steps, each one echoing my own heartbeat, steady and unrelenting. I felt the night air press cool against my flushed cheeks, and I welcomed the sting. I headed toward the river that cut behind the old mill, the same river whose current had become my guide through every twist of betrayal and revenge. Moonlight danced on its surface, fracturing into shards of silver as the water gurgled over stones. I paused at the bank and knelt, fingertips brushing the icy edge, letting the ripples carry away the last tremors in my hands. I let my reflection break apart, a fractured mosaic of pain and resolve. Behind me, a figure emerged from the shadows, him. His footsteps were hesitant, each one sounding like a plea. He stopped a few paces away, posture slumped, shoulders weighed down by more than the night. I didn't turn to face him, I only felt the warmth of his gaze and understood that our story was not yet finished. He spoke in a voice ragged with regret. "Claire, please, let me explain." His words floated through the hush. I stood and brushed cold water from my skin, breathing deeply to steady the ache in my chest. "There's nothing left to explain," I said, voice low. Yet I felt the tremor when I shifted, betraying the truth that some part of me still ached to hear him. He took a cautious step closer. "I lost sight of us," he said, each syllable weighted. "I thought I was protecting you, but I was only protecting myself." The admission landed between us, raw and tremulous. I turned fully at last, meeting his eyes in the pale glow. His face was drawn tight with remorse, skin almost translucent beneath the moon. I saw the toll my revenge had taken on him, the hollow cheekbones, the dark circles under tired eyes, the quiet dread he carried like an anchor. Part of me recoiled, part of me wanted to reach out and dispel that shadow. But I stiffened my spine and folded my arms. "Do you think this fixes anything?" I asked. My voice cracked, betraying emotion I refused to name. He swallowed, throat working. "No," he whispered. "But I need you to know why I did it." He stepped closer, hands open, vulnerable. "The illness, it wasn't just mine. I promised her I'd take care of it alone, that I wouldn't let you see me crumble. I was terrified of losing you to pity." His confession trembled into the night like a prayer. I closed my eyes against the surge of sympathy and fury. My chest tightened, ribs expanding in a desperate breath. "You lied," I said, simple and brutal. "You lied every time you slipped into the night, every time you smiled at me through a veil of secrets." My words collided with the river's song. His gaze never wavered as he listened, as though absorbing each verdict. "I broke your trust," he said, voice so quiet I almost missed it. "And I'm sorry." He took one final step forward, bringing his fingertips to hover beside mine against the river's surface. The water trembled under our combined touch. "I can't change what I did," he continued, "but I can try to rebuild what's left." I felt his warmth, and for a moment my resolve faltered. The river surged past, indifferent to human turmoil. I withdrew my hand, letting the current swallow its echo. I looked back at him, eyes glistening with unshed tears, throat tight. "Rebuild?" I echoed. "After all the walls you erected?" He nodded, shoulders slumping. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said. "I'll face every consequence." He sounded small beneath the vast sky, but his words carried weight. I turned away and walked back along the bank, boots stirring soft mud. He followed without a word, matching my pace. The night held us both in its quiet embrace, two silhouettes bound by broken promises and the fragile threads of what might come next. I realized that although the current of my revenge had carried me here, the river's true power lay in its ability to reshape the banks it touched. And as dawn threatened the horizon, I sensed that our story, still unfinished, would undergo its own transformation beneath the relentless flow of truth and forgiveness. As pale light brushed the horizon, I lingered at the water's edge, heart hammering with anticipation and apprehension. His quiet footsteps sounded behind me, hesitant and measured, like he was walking on eggshells. I didn't turn, I only felt the weight of his presence as the river's gentle roar filled the space between us. My lungs tightened against the chill air, and I pressed my palms into my coat pockets to still the tremor in my hands. The muddy bank felt slippery beneath my boots, each grain of soil a reminder that nothing about our path forward would be easy. He paused a few paces behind, voice low enough to blend with the current. "Claire, I've been thinking, maybe we should go back." His suggestion hung between us, fragile as frost. I closed my eyes against the impulse to reach for him, to bridge the distance. Instead, I breathed in the morning cold and spoke with deliberate calm. "I need to know you can face this with me," I said. "Not run away again." The words came sharper than I intended, a blade forged from lingering hurt. He swallowed, shoulders slumping, and I sensed the fear pulsing beneath his skin. When I turned to face him, I saw more than regret in his eyes, there was resolve. He took a small step forward. "I will," he promised, voice steady now. "Whatever it takes." My pulse surged as I gauged his sincerity. Part of me wanted to believe him, to let that fragile thread of hope draw us together. But the river had taught me that currents could shift beneath a placid surface, and trust once broken demanded proof. I lifted one hand and beckoned him closer, then immediately stiffened at the vulnerability of the gesture. He hesitated, then crossed the final distance. Together we watched the dawn spill its pale gold across the water. I let him stand beside me, close enough to feel the faint warmth of his coat. Neither of us spoke as the sky unfurled from inky purple to soft pink. My mind replayed every moment of betrayal, every secret meeting, every unspoken fear, every tear I'd swallowed to keep him from feeling more ashamed. And yet, witnessing that quiet transformation in him, I felt my own edges soften. At length, I turned fully and met his gaze. "We need rules," I said. "Transparency." My voice was firm, though my heart fluttered like a wounded bird. He nodded, relief and determination mingling in his features. "No secrets," he agreed. "I'll share everything, appointments, calls, every expense. You'll have full access." Relief surged through me, warm and unfamiliar. My chest ached as I realized this was the moment of choice, to step back across the threshold of the cottage with him, into uncertain but shared territory, or to let the current of revenge carry me further downstream alone. I drew a slow breath and extended my hand. His fingers closed around mine, tentative but unyielding. The contact sent a shiver up my arm, a spark of the old intimacy that had once bound us. The river beside us tumbled onward, indifferent to human bargains, yet its steady flow felt like a promise that even the deepest fissure could be smoothed by time and relentless movement. I squeezed his hand, feeling the pulse of his desperation, and his earnest hope. As we turned away from the water, the first birdsong whispered through the trees, heralding a fragile new chapter. I didn't know if love alone could rebuild the walls he had torn down or if forgiveness would always slip through my fingers like sand. But as the world around us stirred to life, I chose to believe that the current of truth, once unleashed, could carry us together towards something neither of us had ever known, a future born from reckoning, honesty, and the slow healing of two broken hearts. Shadows still clung to the path behind us as we stepped into the forest's hush. My hand against his felt warm, but there was a tremor I could still feel, like a favorite chord slightly out of tune. I swallowed, dry mouth scraping my tongue, and reminded myself that transparency wasn't just a promise, it was an unsteady bridge we'd have to cross together. We arrived at the clinic before anyone else, hearts hammering so loudly I feared the walls would hear. I clutched my notebook, full of questions I'd spent hours scribbling, and he carried his medical file under one arm, shoulders stiff. The receptionist gave us polite smiles, unaware of the storm swirling beneath our calm facades. I felt the itch of eyes on me when I whispered our new agreement: every call, every bill, every appointment, we faced them side by side. His nod was small, but it carried something like relief. Inside the waiting room's sterile light, the plastic chairs looked too thin to hold our weight. I noticed the tremor in his fingers as he flipped through appointment cards: 3 days, 5 days, and a referral to a specialist town over. Each date I recorded earned a soft exhale from me, a small victory against the uncertainty that had haunted us. He met my gaze, and for a moment we were simply two people trying to stay afloat. When the nurse called his name, I stood so quickly my chair scraped the tile. He hesitated at the door, chest rising and falling as though inhaling courage. I reached out, thumb brushing his wrist. His pulse rattled like a loose gear. Together, I mouthed, and he stepped into the exam room. Minutes later I followed. He sat on the gurney, legs dangling, boots swinging. The doctor entered, warm voice, professional eyes, and my stomach tightened with dread. I perched on a stool, notebook open on my knee, pen poised. Every time the doctor asked him a question, I saw a flicker of shame cross his face, but then resolve straightened him. He answered honestly: symptoms, side effects, costs. His dry throat rasped words I wished I could smooth over, but I pressed on, guiding him with questions we'd agreed he'd share. After the exam, we walked back through the hall, paper gown crumpled under his arm. The silence between us felt different now, no walls, just an exposed clearing. My legs trembled under that new light, but I forced my shoulders back. "How do you feel?" I asked, voice gentle. He paused, eyes on the linoleum floor. I could almost taste his hesitation. Then he looked up, meeting my gaze with raw honesty. "Terrified," he confessed. His voice broke, and he blinked hard, as though trying to starve tears of their power. I felt my own chest tighten, tears pricking at the edges of my eyes. I stepped close and put a hand to his cheek, his skin cool but trembling. "I'm here," I said simply. My own voice caught, but I held it steady. He nodded, head resting against my palm. There, in that sterile corridor, something shifted. It wasn't a return to what we'd been, it was something new, fragile as spun glass. I guided him to a window that looked out on the parking lot, where a single birch tree bent in the morning breeze. "We'll tackle this," I promised, fingers brushing the scar at his ribs. The memory of that wound, once hidden, felt like a scar on both our hearts now. We left the clinic with new cards, new prescriptions, and a shared folder packed with paperwork. I carried the weight of it all, but he matched my pace, shoulders hunched less with shame and more with purpose. At the car, I slid into the driver's seat, heart fluttering as he settled beside me. He hesitated, then handed me the folder. "For safekeeping," he said, voice quiet. I took it and gave his hand a gentle squeeze before letting go. On the road home, the windscreen dripped with late morning mist. Each drop a reminder that healing wouldn't be immediate, that it spattered in fits and starts. I turned the wheel, eyes on the fog-shrouded road, and felt the current of our truth pulling us forward. In the rearview mirror, I saw his reflection, resolved, vulnerable, alive. I didn't know what lay beyond the next bend, tests, treatments, setbacks, but as the forest slipped by, I realized that this journey, however uncertain, was ours to share. And as long as we kept walking together, honesty guiding every step, even the deepest wounds could begin to close. That evening, back at the cottage, the air felt heavier than before. We settled at the old wooden table, the folder between us like an unspoken barrier. I watched him breathe, slow, deliberate inhalations that made his shoulders rise and fall under the dim lamplight. My fingers ghosted over the manila folder's edges, nails catching on the paper like I was bracing for impact. He sat opposite me, gaze fixed on the table, as though gathering courage from the grain of the wood. I cleared my throat, voice catching. "I found another message," I said softly, sliding a slim envelope across the table. His head snapped up, eyes sharp with alarm. My chest tightened, ribs contracting as my heart pounded. He exhaled slowly, hands coming up to cradle the envelope's corners. "What is it?" he asked, voice low. I pressed my palms flat against the table, feeling the splintered wood beneath my skin. "An email," I replied. "To you, from someone called Marin." His Adam's apple bobbed, and I saw the moment his composure wavered. He unfolded the letter, eyes skimming the lines. The room stretched silent, the only sound the crackle of the lamp's bulb heating up. Then he blinked, head dropping as he read aloud the single sentence that stabbed me. "I can't let her know I confessed everything." My stomach lurched. Heat roared behind my eyes, and I gripped the table so hard my knuckles whitened. "Who is she?" I demanded, voice trembling. He swallowed, jaw working like he was chewing on regret. "My sister," he whispered. The word landed between us like a boulder. I felt my pulse skitter, once, twice, and then thundered in my ears. My legs trembled beneath the table, and I pressed a palm to my forehead to steady the spin in my head. He looked up, eyes glistening. "I didn't want to involve her," he said, tone raw. "She's fragile." A flicker of pity rose in my chest, then darkened into something sharper, rage at being excluded again. My breath came quick, shallow. I leaned forward, sliding the envelope back to him. "You never told me he reached out," I said, voice brittle. "Another secret." He closed his eyes, shoulders sagging. "I thought I was protecting you both," he said. "She doesn't need more pain." My hands fell to my lap, fingers curling into fists. I closed my eyes against the swell of betrayal that washed over me, first his illness, then the hidden meetings, now this. My heart pounded, each beat an echo of outrage. When I opened them again, the lamp's glow made his face look smaller, diminished. "I deserve to know," I said quietly. "No one should hold pieces of our life behind locked doors." The words trembled out, carried on a tremor in my voice. He nodded, tears spilling down his cheeks. I felt something crack inside me, part sorrow, part vindication. "I'll call her," he whispered. "Let you listen in." I stared at him, measuring sincerity against every lie he'd ever told. My chest ached, throat tight. Part of me wanted to reach across the table, to brush his cheek and forgive. But another part recoiled at the shape of his deception. Instead, I rose and walked to the window, pressing my forehead against the cool glass. The woods beyond were black silhouettes, indifferent to human turmoil. The lamplight made my reflection blur, half me, half someone I barely recognized. His footsteps sounded behind me, hesitant. I didn't turn. "Do it now," I said, voice low. "Right now." The folder rustled as he dialed his sister's number, and I watched the faint glow of the phone screen reflected in the glass. He stepped closer, and I felt the syntax of his fear, eyes flicking from my profile to the dark forest. "Claire, I'm sorry," he murmured. My heart quivered at the apology, but I kept my face pressed to the pane, arms crossed tight. The phone rang once, twice. Then a soft voice answered. I couldn't hear her words, but I saw his head nod, tears slipping freely now. He handed me the phone. My pulse hammered as I lifted it to my ear. She spoke, soft, hesitant. I listened to her questions, feeling the weight of every silence between his answers. Each confession he made over the line was another stone pulled from my heart and thrown at the walls he'd built. My vision blurred, tears pricking my eyes. When he hung up, I placed the phone on the sill and turned to face him. His eyes were red, face drawn with exhaustion. Silence stretched, charged. Finally, I exhaled, letting my shoulders drop. No more secrets, I whispered. He swallowed, nodding so vigorously his head bobbed. I stepped forward and touched his hand, tentative, wary. He closed his eyes, leaning into my palm. My own hand felt warm, alive with conflicting currents, betrayal's sting and the fragile pulse of hope. Outside, the forest stood still, waiting for our next move. And in that hush, I realized that even this newest act of truth was only the prelude to another reckoning, one we would have to face together, or not at all. The hush that followed our promise of no more secrets felt almost sacred. I lingered on the edge of the sofa, fingertips grazing the grain of the woodside table as if searching for the imprint of his lies. He stood beside the window, shoulders drawn tight, watching the last of the moonlight slip away. My chest tightened as I remembered how vulnerable he'd been on the phone with his sister, his voice cracking beneath the weight of confession. The forest beyond the glass was still, as though holding its breath for what came next. I drew in a slow breath, tasting the faint tang of pine on the night air that drifted through the cracked window. My legs felt like jelly. I eased back onto the cushions, letting the lamp's soft glow warm my skin. My heartbeat thudded unevenly, part dread, part exhilaration, because the hardest part of honesty isn't confession, it's what we do with the truth afterward. I glanced at him, noticing the way his jaw worked as he turned from the window, hesitation etched between his eyebrows. "Claire," he began, voice low, uncertain. I looked up, catching the tremor in his hands as he tucked a loose strand of hair behind his ear. "I want to show you something," he said, stepping toward the coffee table where the folder lay opened. My stomach fluttered, every fiber of me braced for another revelation, another fracture. I swallowed, voice catching, "Okay." The single word felt too small for everything I wanted to ask, but it was all I could offer. He knelt beside the table and sifted through the papers until he pulled out a thick envelope stamped with the clinic's logo. He held it out, palms shaking. "This is the full report," he said, voice barely more than a whisper. "Results, scans, everything." My fingertips brushed his as I took it, the edge of the envelope cool against my skin. I opened it, and pages fell out, lab results, doctor's notes, a chart tracking his progress. My eyes darted across the numbers, the medical jargon, the side effects he'd never mentioned. Heat rose in my cheeks. I looked up to find him watching me, guilt and hope mingling in his gaze. I felt a wave of anger, relief that I finally had the facts, but rage that he'd made me beg for the truth. My hands clenched the paper until my nails bit into the envelope's fold. "Why hide this?" I demanded, voice trembling. He swallowed, gaze dropping to the floor. "I was ashamed," he confessed. "Ashamed you'd see me as broken." His words hung between us like a confession and a plea. The air felt too tight. My lungs worked harder as I pushed myself up and paced the small living room. Each step echoed off the walls, a reminder that our lives had become exhibitions of pain and trust rebuilt. I smoothed the pages across the coffee table, each sheet a painful mosaic of his hidden suffering. My jaw ached from clenching so long. I stopped, hands on my hips, and met his eyes. "We build walls because we fear collapse," I said, voice raw. "But walls don't heal anyone." He nodded, taking a slow step forward. I felt my resolve waver under the weight of his shame. "I need you," he said, words simple but seismic. "I need you to see me, even the parts I'm scared to share." My breath caught. I thought of his scar, the midnight meetings, the stolen glances in hallways. Then I remembered the gentleness in his apology touch, the way his hand had trembled when he gave me that key. My chest loosened just a fraction. I sank onto the sofa again, motioning for him to sit beside me. He perched on the armrest, awkward in his own skin. I slid the envelope toward him, nudging it gently. "Let's go through this together," I offered. His gaze softened, relief flickering. I picked up the first sheet and began to read aloud, stumbling over medical terms, and he corrected me softly. Our voices intertwined with the flutter of pages, the tension ebbing as knowledge replaced fear. Outside, dawn began to pale the sky. We sat shoulder to shoulder, sharing the data that would guide our next steps, treatments, appointments, possibilities neither of us had dared acknowledge before. In that fragile glow, the forest beyond the window no longer felt like a silent judge, but a witness to our reckoning. And as I spoke the final line of the report, I realized that building a new path wouldn't erase the past, but together, we could navigate every dark current and find a way back to each other. The pale light deepened as we gathered the last of the papers, stacking them into neat piles on the coffee table. I stretched, muscles tight from hunching over charts, and rubbed at the back of my neck until I felt the tension soften. He sank beside me, one hand brushing mine for a heartbeat before pulling away. The cottage felt empty except for our shared breaths and the steady tick of the clock on the mantel. "I've arranged the next appointment," he said, voice low. "The specialist in the city can see me in 2 days." My heart stuttered at the thought of another car ride, another waiting room. I nodded, picking up my mug, now cooled to room temperature. I lifted it, feeling its weight, and took a small sip of bitter coffee. The warmth spread through my chest, anchoring me. He watched me, eyes shadowed. "If you need a break," he offered, "tell me." His words were gentle, but I sensed the tremor beneath them, fear that I might pull away again. I pressed my lips together and let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. "I'm here," I whispered. "Every step." My voice shook, but the promise felt rock solid in my gut. Later, we packed a small bag for the trip, spare clothes, his medical folders, my notebook, and 2 water bottles. I folded his favorite flannel shirt, one he'd never wear again for fear of staining it with tears, and placed it on top. He caught my eye and managed a small, grateful smile. I felt my chest loosen as I zipped the bag shut. On the drive, the road ribboned ahead beneath gray skies. I kept my hand on the gear shift, tapping out a rhythm that matched the beat in my ears. He stared out the window, jaw clenched, and I reached over to rest my hand on his knee. His leg jumped under my touch, and he gave me a quick, awkward glance. I smiled, soft and encouraging, and returned my gaze to the road. We arrived at the specialist's office just as the rain began, a fine mist that turned the parking lot slick. He slid out of the car, jacket pulled tight, and I threw my arm across the roof to brace myself against the sudden lurch of worry. He glanced back, eyes uncertain, and I found his gaze. "We'll do this together," I said. He nodded, stepping forward. Inside, the antiseptic air smelled too clean, rehearsed. We checked in, and I watched his fingers drum on the counter, each tap echoing his nerves. When they called his name, he paused, took a breath that rattled like a loose hinge, and walked into the exam room. I sat in the waiting area, legs crossed at the ankle, scanning the pamphlets about treatment side effects and support groups. My heart pounded every time the door opened. When the doctor emerged, she wore a gentle smile but carried gravitas in her eyes. She motioned me into the room with him. I slid onto the stool beside the gurney, folding my hands in my lap. He sat up, shoulders back, though I could see the tremor in his hands as they rested on his knees. The specialist spoke with clarity, new treatment options, potential complications, realistic outcomes. As she laid out the regimen, I took notes, dosages, timelines, warning signs. His gaze flicked to me, anxiety and trust mingling in his eyes. I nodded at the doctor's instructions, then at him, silently promising I'd remember every detail. Afterward, we stepped back into the hallway, where the hush of the clinic felt heavier. He closed his eyes, breathing out a shaky breath. I reached out, fingers curling around his elbow. "How do you feel?" I asked, voice soft. He took a moment before answering, voice low. "Terrified," he admitted, and I felt a surge of empathy that tightened my chest. I squeezed his elbow, guiding him toward the exit. "We'll face it," I said. "One day at a time." Back in the car, the storm had shifted to heavy rain. We drove in silence until I pulled over at a roadside overlook. Under the blur of raindrops on the windshield, I turned to him. "Tonight," I said, voice earnest, "we talk, no folders, no doctors. Just us." He looked at me, relief flooding his features, and nodded. We sat there as the rain drummed a steady lullaby, sharing memories, the careless laughter on our first trip, the way his hand fit mine like a missing piece, the late-night whispers that once felt eternal. Tears slipped past both our defenses, his from fear, mine from love and grief entwined. When the storm eased, we climbed back into the car. I started the engine, hands steady on the wheel. His hand found mine again, fingers weaving together. Outside, the rain-washed world unfolded fresh and bright. In that quiet unity, after charts, after confessions, after fear, I realized that our next act wouldn't be about secrets or revenge or illness. It would be about rebuilding hope, brick by fragile brick, and trusting the current of our shared truth to carry us home. The morning after the rain, I woke to a hush settling across the cottage, the walls breathing with the echo of last night's confessions. Light filtered through damp curtains, painting pale stripes on the wooden floorboards between our two empty mugs. He lay still beside me, chest rising and falling in a rhythm that hinted at hope and lingering fear. I felt my heart tighten as I reached out, tracing the line of his scar with cautious fingertips. He stirred, blinking awake beneath the soft glow, and offered a trembling smile that felt both apologetic and resolute. "Mornin'," he whispered, voice husky, as I tucked a loose hair behind his ear. I swallowed, letting the word catch in my throat before answering, "We'll get through this, you know." He nodded once, eyes drifting toward the small kitchen where yesterday's dishes waited in a silent pile. We rose together, knees creaking, and moved through the cottage like two parts rediscovering a familiar melody. In the kitchen I filled the kettle, the hiss of the stove a gentle counterpoint to our quiet breaths. He gathered the scattered charts and prescriptions, stacking them neatly beside the sink as if drawing order from chaos. I watched his shoulders relax slightly, the muscle tension easing under each deliberate motion. While water boiled, we stood close, sharing a single mug between us, sipping warmth into chilled hands. Our eyes met over the rim, and without words we agreed on normalcy for at least one meal. I scrambled eggs, stirring butter into the pan with soft clinks, imagining this simple ritual as a balm. He set the table, 2 plates, 2 forks, 2 cloth napkins, the symmetry soothing as a promise. We ate slowly, acknowledging each other with shy glances and soft murmurs, the silence now comfortable. After, I cleared the dishes while he fetched wood for the hearth, the kindling crackling like small applause. He struck a match beneath the grate, sparks scattering as warmth bloomed through the room. I sank onto the couch, wrapping a wool blanket around my shoulders, listening to the fire's steady breath. He sat beside me, pressing his back against the cushions, and rested his head against my shoulder. His weight felt heavy with gratitude and unspoken questions, making my ribs ache with protective tenderness. Outside, the sky grayed with gathering clouds, reminding us that calm never lasts forever. I tilted my head, hearing the distant rumble of thunder like a warning drumbeat. He shifted, releasing a quiet sigh, his fingertips brushing across the back of my hand. "News came today," he said softly, voice tight with uncertainty and duty. My chest constricted, pulse stuttering as I turned to meet his gaze. "They found another account," he continued, words heavy, linked to that old clinic. A chill slid through me, colder than any storm, as Betrayal's shadow flickered again. I swallowed against a dry throat and exhaled, summoning the determination that had carried me this far. "Show me," I said, voice steady even as my hands trembled around the blanket. He pulled a crumpled statement from his coat pocket, edges frayed like old wounds. As I read the numbers and faded notes, recognition and dread wove through my veins. His face tightened, guilt and fear mirrored in his eyes as he awaited my verdict. The moment stretched between us, a fragile rope that both tethered and threatened to snap. I folded the paper with trembling fingers, feeling the old ache of betrayal open anew. Yet beneath the ache, a steely resolve burned. No more walls, no more lies, only truth. I met his gaze and allowed compassion to lace through my anger, binding us together again. "We'll face this," I promised, voice soft but unwavering, just like before. He nodded, relief and resolve shining in his wet eyes, and pressed my hand to his heart. Outside thunder rolled closer, but inside, amid shaky promises and fresh revelations, we chose each other. And as the storm broke against the windows, our shared confession became the anchor that steadied us. The rain pelted the windows like urgent footsteps as we stood in the flickering firelight, the crumpled bank statement trembling in my hand. He pressed his palm to mine, fingers warm but shaky. I looked up into his eyes, raw with shame and pleading, and felt the old ache twist into determination. "We'll call them now," I said, voice low but firm. He nodded, swallowing against the tightness in his throat. My heart pounded, each thump a reminder that trust once broken demands constant repair. I grabbed the receiver from the side table and dialed the bank's fraud line. He hovered at my shoulder, his breath warm against my neck. I spoke clearly, each word measured. I needed to report an unauthorized account in his name, to freeze any activity immediately. The agent's voice was polite but procedural. As she confirmed the freeze, I felt a shiver run down my spine, both relief and a sting of betrayal. I pressed my eyes shut, breathing through the tremor that still rattled my hands. When I hung up, he leaned against the mantel, shoulders sagging like an exhausted weight. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, voice breaking. I set the phone down and turned to face him, pressing my fingertips to his cheek. His skin was cool beneath my touch, and I could see the fine lines of worry etched around his eyes. "We can handle this," I said, though my voice caught as heat flared behind my ribs. "Together." He blinked, tears pooling, and nodded, the tremor in his jaw betraying how close he was to collapse. We gathered our coats and headed into the storm. The forest road back toward town was slick with mud and shadows, each tree a silent witness to our fragile resolve. He kept his gaze on the ground, boots crunching through wet leaves, while I steered the car through winding bends. I glanced at him through the rearview mirror, his profile etched in lamplight, eyes hooded with guilt. I reached back, resting a hand on his shoulder. He relaxed against me, as if drawing strength from that simple gesture. At the clinic's entrance, the awning dripped with rain. We shook off water and stepped inside, greeted by antiseptic fumes and hushed conversation. I approached the front desk and explained we needed to speak with the administrator about billing discrepancies. The receptionist's eyebrows rose, but she directed us to a small office down the hall. We walked side by side, our footsteps muffled by the carpet, hearts hammering in tandem. Inside the office, the administrative woman looked up from her computer. She skimmed through our patient ID and the account numbers I jotted on a scrap of paper. Her expression turned apologetic. "I see the issue," she said, typing swiftly. "It appears a secondary account was set up for additional services, counseling sessions you weren't informed about." I felt a flush of anger ripple through me, tightening my chest like a vice. He swallowed, jaw working. "I never authorized it," he said, voice shaky. The administrator blinked, then paged the clinic director. Moments later, the director strode in, professional heels clicking on tile, clipboard in hand. She offered a polite nod, then scanned the documents. "I apologize for the oversight," she said. "We have a policy requiring patient consent for all services. I can void these charges and issue a refund immediately." Relief and indignation warred inside me. I crossed my arms, studying him through narrowed eyes until he met my gaze and nodded, grateful for my advocacy. I accepted the director's offer, setting conditions for written confirmation and a follow-up audit. She agreed, handing me a stamped letter of apology and refunded invoice. Back in the car, the rain had eased to a drizzle. He exhaled a shaky breath, restlessness and relief mingling on his face. I placed the papers on my lap, smoothing the edges with my palm. "You deserve transparency every step of the way," I said, voice softening as I reached for his hand. His fingers closed around mine, careful and thankful. We sat there a moment, the engine idling, listening to the gentle patter of droplets on the roof. Driving home, the woods on either side seemed less menacing, the road a ribbon of possibility rather than fear. He turned to me, voice hushed. "I'm learning how to share my burdens," he confessed. "Thank you for standing by me." I smiled, warmth blooming in my chest despite the chill outside. "We're learning together," I replied. No more shadows. When we reached the cottage, the fire had burned low to embers. We carried the administrative letter inside and placed it on the table alongside his medical folder and my notebook. The trio of documents, a confession, a report, and an apology, felt like stepping stones across a river. I lit fresh kindling, sparks dancing to life. He stood close, letting the warmth chase away the lingering dampness on his shoulders. As the flames steadied, he wrapped his arms around me, resting his chin on my head. I closed my eyes, pressing back into him, feeling both the ache of what we'd endured and the fragile hope of what we'd rebuilt. Outside, the storm clouds parted, revealing a sliver of moonlight. Inside, amid the glow of truth and trust restored, we found a moment of peace before the next bend in our shared journey. The dawn light filtered through the mist one last time, painting the clearing in soft gold as I stepped onto the porch. The cottage behind us was quiet, its windows dark, its hearth cold, and I realized how far we'd come together and how much remained unknown. I held his hand, fingers interlaced with mine, and felt the familiar tremor of hope and fear coiling in my chest. Today would be the final turning of our shared reckoning, the moment when we either closed the book on betrayal or watched it tear open once more. We walked down the mossy path toward the riverbank where our journey had first shifted beneath the weight of secrets. Each footfall felt solid, grounded in purpose. He glanced at me, eyes steady now, and offered a small, grateful smile. "Ready?" he asked, voice husky with emotion. I nodded, throat tight, and lifted both our hands high above the rushing water. It sparkled beneath us, indifferent yet alive, carrying branches and leaves downstream with easy authority. I took a deep breath and spoke the words I had practiced in my mind on endless sleepless nights. "I forgive you." The syllables landed between us on the humid air, quivering like the surface of the water. His grip tightened, and he closed his eyes, as though letting the current of those words wash over him. For a heartbeat I thought he might say something else, another confession, another excuse, but he remained silent, tears tracing tracks down his rough cheeks. We lowered our hands, palms turning toward the river's flow. I felt the cool breeze kiss my skin, and I let the image of every lie and every apology drift downstream in my mind. The river carried them away, scattering them into fragments of memory I no longer needed to clutch. "We start fresh," I whispered, eyes locked on the moving water. "Together, without walls." He opened his eyes and nodded, a flicker of relief lighting his features. Behind me, the morning chorus of birds rose in response, as though celebrating our fragile peace. He drew in a shuddering breath, then guided me along a hidden path that wound through wildflowers and low-hanging branches. The path led to a small clearing where a single stone bench overlooked the water's bend. He gestured for us to sit, and we sank side by side, shoulders touching. I drew my coat tight around us both and let the silence settle, a companionable, healing hush. He reached into his pocket and retrieved a folded scrap of paper, a list of his appointments, dates mapped out over the coming months, names of doctors, therapists, and support groups he'd agreed to see, numbers for crisis hotlines, monthly calendars marked for check-ins between us. He handed it to me with trembling hands. "My truth," he said simply. "All of it." I unfolded the paper and traced each line with my fingertip, feeling the weight of his promise in every word. Tears pricked my eyes as I folded the list and tucked it into my coat. I turned to face him fully. "We'll face it," I said, voice thick. "All of it." My hand found his, and I squeezed, letting him know that forgiveness was not forgetting but choosing to bear witness together. He leaned his head against my shoulder, exhaling a breath that sounded like release. We sat like that for long moments, the river's song filling the space between our hearts. In the distance, clouds gathered on the horizon, but the light around us remained warm. The world had shifted again, no longer governed by betrayal's undercurrent but by the steady pulse of honesty and shared resolve. I realized that our story, once a fracture of trust and deception, had become a testament to vulnerability's power to heal. When we finally rose, the sun had climbed higher, scattering diamonds of light across the water's surface. He offered me his arm, and I accepted, leaning into him as we walked back toward the cottage. Each step felt lighter, unburdened by secrets, buoyed instead by possibility. As we rounded the bend, I glanced over my shoulder at the river, its current unchanged, yet transformed by all it had carried away. We reached the cottage door and paused. He looked at me, lips curved in a tentative smile. "Thank you," he whispered. I returned his smile and took a deep breath before resting my forehead against his. "Thank you for trusting me," I replied. In that quiet communion, I understood that our final act was not an ending but the first chapter of a new beginning, one written not in hidden ink but in open hearts, bound by the relentless flow of truth.